Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons and its very unusual relationship to podcasts, and why the Dungeons & Dragons community should watch the podcast community and the podcast product overall carefully. All right. So podcasts are a really, really fascinating subject for me. I love podcasts, and I am incredibly blessed to have seen the full history of podcasts. So I wrote a book called Amerindian 2192, and when podcasts blew up, I turned it into a podio book, which was like books as podcasts, right? It's still out there. You could listen to it now, right? But I was there at the very beginning of podcasts, and when I listened to my first podcast, I was like, oh my gosh, this is really incredible, right? The reason why was it was like a radio show that you did not need to listen to at the time it was airing. It would wait for you. You could start it, and it could be on any topic. And only the smartest people in the world were messing with it, right? So if you listen to a podcast, you self-selectively ended up listening to a smart person talking about something that they were passionate about, period, right? Because and here's the kicker, right? Podcasts weren't simple. It wasn't simple to do a podcast. You had to understand RSS feeds. You had to be pretty deep down the tech curve, right? To have a podcast. And so, or somebody you knew did, right? So basically, the first thing that podcasts were a filter for was smart, okay? And podcasts are still a filter for smart, okay? I think the exact same is true about Dungeons & Dragons. Generally, people who aren't smart are absolutely not interested in Dungeons & Dragons. It all takes place in your brain, right? People who struggle with putting stuff in their brain generally ain't going to be interested in Dungeons & Dragons. That's just the way of it. Self-select. So both podcasts and both Dungeons & Dragons are self-selecting for smart, okay? Now, here's where it gets sticky. Podcasts absolutely never intended this, nor did Dungeons & Dragons intend this. But podcasts are now, without a doubt, a filter for wealth. The only people left at the macro level listening to podcasts are super wealthy, right? Because the reality is podcasts are a dying product. There is no two ways about that. They are not growing. And the reason why is, one, it's audio-centric, right? And basically, there's no need in the world for all these podcast filters and all this kind of stuff. Just take your audio and throw it up on YouTube, which is the strongest streaming platform that is available for free anywhere in the world. There's no need for any of the podcatchers or any of this stuff, right? And by the way, 7 years ago, let's just go there, right? I had 2 podcatchers, and I had 30 podcasts on it, right? Today, I have one podcatcher, one podcatcher, right? That's something that plays a podcast. And I have one podcast left. One. That's it, right? I only listen to one podcast through a podcast. I actually listen to 2 podcasts now. And one I listen to directly on the site because I actually pay like some kind of premium service, which actually makes the product worse because I can't use a regular podcatcher with it. That's a whole thing. I'm not going to get into it here, right? But podcasts are absolutely dying. They are going away. Okay, they are not growing in the number of people who are listening to podcasts. I'm convinced of this, right? However, here's the kicker. Podcasts pay a ton to very specific communities of podcast content creators. They also serve as a very distinct off-to-the-side channel for material that is not going to be that might have a challenge distributing their content in other places, right? Very strange aspect of podcasts, right? But the reality is, if you have a podcast, if you make a channel, right, and you have 1 million plus listeners, which a lot of influencers and a lot of entertainers, a lot of authors, a lot of musicians. If you have 1 million plus followers, get yourself a podcast, you're going to make money. Thousands a month, thousands a week, right? No two ways about it. And the reason why, the reason why is basically advertisers are falling all over themselves to get podcast advertisement time. And the reason why is everybody listening to podcasts has money. It's a very real thing, right? But at the same time, podcasts have this very real problem of they are losing relevancy. There's no legitimate need for them anymore. But because they established themselves, and they never intended to, as a filter for smart and a filter for rich, right? They're going to have a very arbitrarily extended life as a product, right? That is Dungeons and Dragons all over, right? I desperately love Dungeons and Dragons, but you know what I like about Dungeons and Dragons? I sure as heck don't like D&D Beyond. If D&D Beyond disappeared tomorrow, it wouldn't affect my life in one single way, right? And the reason why is what I want from Dungeons and Dragons are real print books. Guess what? There is zero need for print books anymore, and that is a format that is dying every single day in relevancy, exactly like podcasts, right? Now, why should we be paying attention to this? Why should the Dungeons & Dragons community pay very close attention to how the podcast community and the podcast product are doing? Well, I'll give you a reason. Not more than a year ago, there was a deal that was made for a podcast network that was over $220 million. That's a lot of cheddar. That's 2 years of the entire tabletop role-playing game industry. The whole industry, right? That is a ton of money. And that was for a single podcast network. One single network. So the relationship of podcasts to smart, the relationship of podcasts to wealth, right, is very, very interesting, right? And I'll tell you right now, very few people fully understand it. That is a definite thing. Very few people actually understand what's happening with podcasts, right? Very, very small amount of people who generally, if they're paying attention and they're savvy, can turn that into wealth pretty easily. Still, right? It's the same with Dungeons and Dragons. I think people look at Dungeons and Dragons, they're like, oh, it's some fantasy role-playing game, probably doesn't make much money, right? Which they're right, doesn't make a whole lot of money, but I feel like it is massively misunderstood. And basically, Dungeons and Dragons has a relationship to smart and has a relationship to wealth that is just not fully understood, right? And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about it, is I believe that Dungeons and Dragons in many ways is a puzzle that is still revealing itself, and that it is much more than a game, and that its full potential is not even remotely tapped, right? So I really think that the Dungeons and Dragons community should pay very close attention to what happens with podcast community and with the podcast overall overarching product, because I think they're linked. They really are very much linked. They're both products, right, that never intended to align themselves closely and powerfully with intelligence and wealth, but boy, have they done it, right? And so for that reason, they have this very unusual link. That's my opinion. What do you think? Do you see the link I'm talking about? What are some of the ways that understanding Dungeons and Dragons' unintentional link to smartness and wealth could change things for the better for dungeon masters and for players? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.